For over a century, the identity of Jack the Ripper remained one of criminal history's most enduring unsolved mysteries. In 2019, a self-published author announced he'd solved it using DNA evidence. According to more recent reports, he's now trying to make that claim official in a British court. The science behind his announcement, though, tells a considerably more complicated story than the headlines suggest, and it's worth walking through exactly why. Let's start with what actually happened in the autumn of 1888, because the real history matters more than most retellings give it credit for. London was gripped by genuine terror. The narrow, fog-choked streets of Whitechapel, one of the city's poorest and most desperate neighborhoods, became the hunting ground for a killer whose brutality shocked even a city accustomed to violence. Between August and November of that year, at least 5 women were murdered within a roughly 13-week span. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These were women living in genuine poverty, several of them sex workers trying to survive in one of the most dangerous slums in the world. Their deaths, and the sensational press coverage surrounding them, transformed them, somewhat unfairly, into supporting characters in the story of the man who killed them rather than being remembered as people in their own right. The murders themselves showed disturbing anatomical precision. Throats slashed with apparent expertise, organs removed with what investigators at the time described as deliberate, almost surgical care. This led contemporary investigators toward theories involving someone with medical or anatomical training, a doctor, a butcher, or someone with comparable hands-on knowledge of the human body. Despite an extensive Metropolitan Police investigation, the killer was never conclusively identified, and Jack the Ripper, a name derived from a taunting letter sent to press and police at the time, whose authenticity remains debated among historians, became one of history's most famous unsolved criminal cases. Over the following century, an enormous number of suspects were proposed, ranging from genuinely plausible historical figures to increasingly speculative and sometimes outright fanciful candidates, everyone from minor local criminals to, in some of the more extravagant theories, members of the royal family. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to by researchers and enthusiasts of the case as Ripperology, has produced an entire subgenre of historical true crime research and publishing spanning well over a century, with new books and theories continuing to appear regularly even today. Aaron Kosminski specifically emerged as a genuine, documented police suspect during the original 1888 investigation, named in surviving police files, and in the private notes of a senior police official, Sir Robert Anderson, and his memoirs, alongside marginalia reportedly added by a colleague, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, identifying a suspect referred to only as Kosminski as a leading candidate. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant working as a barber in Whitechapel, who was later institutionalized for mental illness, a set of biographical details that made him a genuinely serious historical candidate for Ripperology researchers, long before any DNA evidence entered the picture at all. Now, to the DNA story specifically, because this is where things get genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint, in ways that go well beyond just this one case. In 2007, an author and true crime enthusiast named Russell Edwards purchased a silk shawl at auction, one that had reportedly been recovered from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder in 1888. The shawl carried stains that some believed to be blood, others semen. Edwards spent years pursuing his own research into the garment before eventually commissioning formal forensic analysis in the years leading up to 2019, working with Dr. Ari Luhalainen, a molecular biologist, and Dr. David Miller, a reproductive biology specialist at the University of Leeds. Their team extracted and amplified DNA from the stained areas of the shawl and compared it against DNA from living descendants of Catherine Eddowes, along with DNA from descendants of Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant barber who had genuinely been identified as a suspect during the original 1888 police investigation. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the shawl reportedly showed a match consistent with the maternal lines of both Eddowes and Kosminski. The findings were published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in March 2019, a real peer-reviewed publication. Interestingly, the initial publication drew relatively little public attention. It wasn't until years later in early 2025 that Edwards, according to more recent reporting, brought the claim back into the public eye with considerably more forceful, definitive public statements about Kosminski's guilt. Here's where the actual science requires real scrutiny, and where the gap between what the evidence can support and what's been publicly claimed becomes genuinely significant. The first and most fundamental issue involves the specific type of DNA analyzed. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line, meaning every person sharing the same mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and so on back through history shares an essentially identical mitochondrial DNA sequence. This makes mitochondrial DNA genuinely useful for excluding suspects. If a sample doesn't match a person's maternal lineage, you can say with real confidence that person isn't the source, but a match works very differently. A mitochondrial match tells you the DNA came from someone within an entire maternal family line, potentially spanning many people across many generations, not from one specific, identifiable individual. Hansi Weissensteiner, a mitochondrial DNA specialist at Innsbruck Medical University in Austria, has been publicly clear about exactly this limitation. Mitochondrial DNA can only meaningfully exclude a suspect, not positively identify one, since the same maternal lineage could plausibly belong to many other people who happen to share that same ancestral line, potentially including numerous other men living in London at the time. It's worth explaining this limitation in slightly more concrete terms, because the underlying concept is genuinely important and not always communicated clearly in popular coverage of DNA evidence generally. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost entirely unchanged from mother to child across generations, which makes it genuinely powerful for certain kinds of historical identification, including, famously, confirming the identity of the remains of King Richard III when they were uncovered beneath a car park in Leicester in 2012, while using an unbroken maternal line traced across more than 5 centuries. But that same property that makes it powerful for tracing lineage is exactly what makes it weak for pinpointing one specific individual. Unlike nuclear DNA, which recombines uniquely from both parents and is, outside of identical twins, essentially unique to each individual person, mitochondrial DNA is shared identically by potentially hundreds or even thousands of living people who share a common maternal ancestor, sometimes going back many generations. A mitochondrial match in a case like this is genuinely meaningful as a starting point for investigation, but treating it as equivalent to a full nuclear DNA match, the kind of evidence that actually can identify a specific individual with a very high degree of statistical confidence, fundamentally misrepresents what the test is actually capable of establishing. There's also a serious, well-documented issue involving contamination and chain of custody. The shawl, if it's genuinely connected to the crime scene at all, a claim that itself lacks solid contemporary 1888 documentation, spent well over a century passing between different private owners, stored under unknown and almost certainly inconsistent conditions, handled by an unknown number of people across generations before any formal forensic analysis was ever conducted. In forensic science, this kind of uncontrolled chain of custody is a serious, well-recognized problem. While DNA contamination from any of the many people who touched or stored the item over more than 100 years could easily have introduced genetic material entirely unrelated to the original 1888 crime. And there's no reliable way, at this distance in time, to fully rule that possibility out. This isn't a hypothetical concern specific to this one case either. It reflects a broader, well-established principle in forensic science, generally regarding the reliability of cold case evidence recovered from items without a documented, unbroken chain of custody. Modern crime scene protocols exist specifically to prevent exactly this kind of contamination risk. Sealed evidence bags, documented handling logs, controlled storage conditions, precisely because forensic scientists have learned often the hard way. Perhaps the most important limitation, though, is a logical one rather than a purely technical one. Even setting aside the mitochondrial DNA and contamination concerns entirely, and assuming for the sake of argument that the DNA genuinely and exclusively belonged to Kosminski, what would that actually prove? At most, it would establish that Kosminski had some form of intimate physical contact with Catherine Eddowes at some point. It would not, on its own, establish that he murdered her, that he was present at the murder scene, or that he was responsible for any of the other killings attributed to the Ripper. Physical contact and murder are two entirely different claims, and conflating them represents a significant logical leap well beyond what the evidence itself can support. Forensic DNA interpretation expert Jared Ambo, speaking to News Nation in 2025, reportedly described Edwards' claims as falling well short of solid proof of guilt, emphasizing that the inherent limitations of mitochondrial DNA analysis make definitive individual identification scientifically unreliable using this specific method. This kind of criticism from working forensic scientists has been a consistent thread running through the scientific response to Edwards' claims since well before the more recent renewed publicity, not a new reaction manufactured after the fact. It's also worth being clear that Edwards' original 2019 findings were never independently replicated by another laboratory working under blind conditions, a standard, essential step in establishing scientific reliability. Independent replication is exactly what allows other researchers to confirm that a result reflects something real rather than a methodological artifact, contamination, or misinterpretation specific to one lab's process. Without that replication, Edwards' results have remained a single unconfirmed data point in the broader scientific literature, one that's drawn real, substantive published criticism regarding methodology and data presentation, rather than being treated as an established, settled scientific finding. A published critical review of Edwards' findings raised specific concerns about how the underlying raw data was interpreted and presented, including questions about which specific genetic markers were used to establish the claimed match and whether the statistical significance of that match was properly calculated and reported. Geneticists examining the published paper have noted that some of the specific mitochondrial variants cited as distinctive matches are, according to broader population genetic databases, actually shared by a meaningfully large number of people across European populations generally, further undermining the strength of any claimed match beyond what a simple shared maternal lineage would already predict. This is precisely the kind of technical methodological critique that peer review and independent scientific scrutiny are specifically designed to surface. And it's exactly the kind of nuance that tends to disappear entirely once a finding gets compressed into a confident television announcement. The legal history behind Edwards' pursuit of formal official recognition for his theory is also worth understanding in a bit more detail, because it illustrates just how high the evidentiary bar sits for reopening a case of this age and significance within the British legal system. Edwards first sought permission to exhume Kosminski's remains in 2012, a request that was denied. A second exhumation request in 2016 was similarly rejected. Formal applications for a new coroner's inquest into Catherine Eddowes' death, submitted in 2019 and again in 2021, were both rejected by the Attorney General's office, citing insufficient new evidence to justify reopening a case of this age. Each of these rejections reflects a legal system applying a genuinely high, consistent standard, requiring evidence considerably more robust than a single, unreplicated mitochondrial DNA study before agreeing to formally re-examine a death that occurred well over a century earlier. According to reports from 2025, a third application for a formal inquest was underway, this time reportedly with public statements of support from descendants connected to both the victim and the accused, though I'm not in a position to independently verify the current status or ultimate outcome of that specific legal process. According to more recent reporting from 2025, Edwards has continued pursuing this claim through the British legal system, having previously sought and been denied permission to exhume Kosminski's remains in 2012 and 2016, and having had earlier requests for a formal inquest rejected by the Attorney General in 2019 and 2021 for insufficient new evidence. Reports indicate a third attempt at securing a formal inquest was underway as of 2025, reportedly drawing public support from descendants on both sides, including a descendant of Catherine Eddowes and a descendant of Kosminski himself, both reportedly expressing a desire for legal clarity and closure after more than a century of uncertainty. I want to be appropriately careful here, since I can't independently verify the specific names, statements, or current legal status of that inquest process with full confidence, given how recent and specific these particular claims are. What's worth sitting with, regardless of how that specific legal process ultimately resolves, is a genuinely important and broader point about forensic science communication. There's a meaningful difference between DNA evidence is consistent with, and doesn't rule out, Kosminski having had contact with one victim, and DNA evidence proves Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, and that difference isn't a minor technicality, it's the entire question. The first statement is a modest, scientifically defensible claim. The second is a considerably larger claim the underlying evidence, as currently presented and reviewed, doesn't actually support, according to the consistent published assessment of independent forensic DNA specialists who've examined the methodology. This case is also a genuinely useful real-world illustration of a broader pattern worth understanding whenever DNA evidence gets invoked in historical mysteries generally. Mitochondrial DNA testing has real, legitimate forensic uses, particularly in exclusion, in identifying remains through maternal lineage when other methods aren't available, and in certain genealogical and historical research contexts. But its limitations are equally real, and they don't disappear just because a claim is presented with confidence in a television interview or a best-selling book. The same core limitation that applies here, that a mitochondrial match points to an entire maternal lineage rather than one specific person, applies to any historical DNA identification claim built primarily on mitochondrial evidence, and it's exactly the kind of nuance that tends to get lost when a genuinely complex scientific finding gets compressed into a dramatic headline. There's a real human dimension to this story, too, one worth taking seriously alongside the scientific critique. The 5 women killed in 1888 were, for well over a century, largely remembered as footnotes to the story of their killer, rather than as people with their own lives, relationships, and histories. Mary Ann Nichols was a mother of 5, before circumstances forced her onto the streets of Whitechapel. Annie Chapman had been married for decades before separating from her husband and losing custody of her children to illness and poverty. Elizabeth Stride had emigrated from Sweden years earlier, building and then losing a series of different lives in London. Catherine Eddowes had a long-term partner and children of her own. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest victim, was still in her 20s. Each of these was a genuinely complete, complicated human life, reduced for generations in popular imagination to little more than a body count attached to a more famous killer's legend. Whatever the scientific merits or flaws of Edwards' specific claims, the renewed attention this case has drawn has at least prompted some public reconsideration of the victims themselves as individuals rather than simply props in a sensationalized murder mystery. And for descendants of both the victims and the accused, after more than a century of unresolved uncertainty, the desire for some kind of legal or historical closure is a genuinely understandable human impulse, even if the underlying scientific evidence doesn't currently meet the standard needed to fully satisfy it. The tension between a real, sympathetic human desire for resolution and the genuinely more limited answer the actual evidence supports sits at the heart of why this case continues generating headlines nearly a century and a half after the murders themselves. What this case ultimately illustrates, more than providing a final answer to a 137-year-old question, is exactly how forensic DNA evidence should and shouldn't be represented to the public. Real science moves cautiously, flags its own limitations explicitly, and welcomes independent replication before treating a finding as settled. When a claim skips past that caution and moves straight to absolute certainty in a television interview, that's usually a signal worth paying close attention to, regardless of how compelling or emotionally satisfying the underlying story might be. This distinction matters well beyond this one case too, because cold case DNA claims of exactly this kind, dramatic, publicly announced, built around historical evidence recovered decades or centuries after the fact, tend to recur regularly in true crime media. And the same basic questions are worth asking every time one surfaces. Was the DNA extraction and analysis independently replicated by a separate laboratory? What specific type of DNA was actually tested, and what are that method's known, documented limitations for individual identification? What was the chain of custody for the physical evidence being tested, and how much time and how many hands did it pass through before formal analysis began? And critically, even granting the DNA result at face value, what does it actually logically prove, as opposed to what it's being publicly claimed to prove? Applying that same basic framework consistently to this case and to whichever similar claim inevitably surfaces next is a genuinely useful habit for evaluating this entire genre of sensational cold case announcement. If getting the honest, carefully sourced version of famous mysteries, including an accurate account of what the evidence can and can't actually prove, is what you're here for, subscribe. Because separating real scientific findings from confident overstatement is exactly the kind of story worth taking the time to get right.